World. The way to support the festival and support our authors, of course, is to go to the book sales tent and buy the book, and then meet Andrew over at the signing tent after this, and he'll sign your book for you. And the book signings do follow every session, so please do that. And please, enjoy. There's a tent with food. We have water from Island Source. Please make sure you hydrate. It's very hot today. It's a little deceiving. And we will hold a little time at the end for questions, about 10 minutes, George, 10, 15 minutes. And I think the question sessions have been really good, but please ask a question, not a really long statement in your lead up to the question. We would appreciate that. So today we're very honored to welcome Andrew Lawler discussing his book, A Perfect Frenzy, with George Gibson. Andrew is the North Carolina-based author of A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution, the largely untold story of rebellion in Virginia. For those of you at the back of the tent, could you move a little bit farther away? Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Andrew. Andrew is the author of the national bestsellers, The Secret Token and Under Jerusalem. Lawler is a prolific contributor to such publications as the New York Times, National Geographic, which we just talked about, Smithsonian, Science, and Archaeology. And he'll be interviewed and joined in conversation with George Gibson, who joined Grove Atlantic as the executive editor in January 2017. George was at Bloomsbury for 23 years, where he edited and published a number of acclaimed works of nonfiction, including Dava Sobel's Longitude and Galileo's Daughter, Mark Kurlansky's Salt, a very popular book in New England, and Carol Anderson's White Rage. He serves also on the board of the Book Festival. So please join me in welcoming both of them to the tent. Thank you for being here.
So is this on? Is it on? Yeah. You can hear? Okay. I can't. I can't hear you. So, yeah, I'm George Gibson. I also have the great pleasure of being Andrew's editor. So this is fun for me to interview Andrew. It's obviously a very familiar story to me, but it's fun to have the interaction. And one of the things I want to talk about is the interaction between author and editor, because I think that's something that you don't necessarily always hear. But my job as an editor is to find exciting new projects, and all nonfiction comes to editors in the form of a proposal. And proposals are anywhere from 20 to 50 pages, and they outline what the author intends to do and what he or she expects the book to be. And as editors, we're all serial gamblers. We particularly with nonfiction, because we don't know what the book's going to be at the end of the day. We have to use our own instincts and what we see on the page and decide whether we want to invest in that. And so I got Andrew's proposal, and within 2 pages, I made a decision that I wanted to make an offer on it. And I did that for 2 reasons. Because of its originality, and because of its the voice on the page. And those are the 2 things that editors are always looking for: an original story that they haven't heard before, and a voice on the page that speaks to them. And in both those cases, within 2 pages, I was ready to tell the publisher of Grove Atlantic, we need to make an offer on this. He read the proposal, and I would say it probably took him 7 or 8 pages, but by that time he was hooked as well. And that's true about Morgan. He instantly we got it. And the remarkable thing about this book is that the American Revolution is so well chronicled. I mean, there are thousands of books that have been written about the American Revolution. So that to come upon a major story that has not been told before, much less one that will truly change your understanding of the Revolution. This book will change the way you understand the American Revolution. The fact that hasn't been told before now is extraordinary in and of itself. But that's what compelled me to want to publish this book, because it was clear from the proposal that the book would be both those things. And it became even better in the writing than I'd anticipated. And so if you're interested in the American Revolution and the origins of our country, this book is going to give you a new and fresh perspective on that, without question. And it's also going to reveal the seeds of much of the societal tension that we feel today. And it's fascinating to go back, 250 years and see the seeds of what is playing out in our country today. And they were all there on the ground in Virginia in 1775. So, enough of me. Start, Andrew, with, and set the stage in early 1775 in Virginia on any number of levels. Economically, the geography of Virginia, introduce Lord Dunmore and his position in the state. Set the stage in 1775 in Virginia.
Okay, well, thank you, George. Can everybody hear me? There we go. So first of all, this is a very deeply personal story, even though everybody in it is dead. I grew up in this area, and the reason I wanted to write it was because I stumbled on a couple of facts that contradicted what I had been taught growing up in a very history-minded family, and I kind of got mad. So I decided to get even by actually digging into find out really what happened in this place where I grew up. And to my surprise, and really to my astonishment, I discovered that this story, which has been so untold, as George mentioned, is really critical to understanding how we became a nation in the first place. So with that, I'll set a little of the stage. So Virginia was very, very different from New England, right? New England was a place where you had merchants who were trading with Britain, ships going back and forth, people very concerned about tariffs and taxes, right? Things like that. But Virginia was different because it was run by tobacco planters who made up this gentry, we call the Virginia gentry, and they controlled the politics of the state. They didn't so much control the economics because they sold their tobacco to Scottish merchants who would then carry them over to England. So there's this tension between the English and the Scots, which is really important to this story. So at that time, 1775, Virginia is the largest, wealthiest, most populous of all the British colonies in North America. It's easy to forget, but West Virginia was also part of Virginia in those days before the Civil War. And also, Kentucky had recently been added to Virginia. So it was really an enormous territory that stretched practically to the Mississippi. So in that time, the governor of the colony was Lord Dunmore. Now, he's this fascinating character. He's a Scottish aristocrat who was part of the Jacobite Rebellion. He had actually, his father, and he had actually tried to overthrow King George II. If anybody has seen Outlander? Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So it's a very challenging time in British history. Dunmore, though, because of the vagaries of the British system, ends up then as the royal governor of this most important of provinces in 1771. And so at that point, for about 4 years, he befriends the Virginia gentry, including a guy you may have heard of, George Washington, right? You know, he becomes best friends with George Washington. And what do they have in common? What they have in common is this intense desire for more land. Because in Virginia, land was money. Land meant tobacco. It meant if you had enough enslaved people, you could grow more tobacco. You could become fabulously wealthy. But the problem was this, and this is really critical to understanding why things went the way they did in 1776. King George III had decided that he had enough of these wars between the colonists and the Indians. The French and Indian War had ended in around 1760 or so. And in 1763, the king said, all right, all the white people have to stay east of the Appalachians, and the Indians, who are now under my control at the end of the French and Indian War, I'm their sovereign, I want to protect them, they have to stay on the west side. And if the two of you don't mix it up, then we won't have another expensive war that I'll have to pay for, because Britain was deeply in debt. So this really, really irritated people like George Washington, who were running out of land because tobacco, of course, chews up the land. You've got to keep moving west. You always need new land. And suddenly they were blocked. You couldn't legally own any territory west of the Appalachians. And this became the reason why the Virginia gentry were really happy to basically secede from the British Empire, because in doing so, they no longer were bound by this barrier that prevented them from getting even richer.
And what was the greatest fear that the Virginia aristocracy had at the time?
Well, 4 out of 10 Virginians, of course, were enslaved. And these were the people who primarily were working in the tobacco fields throughout Virginia. And this had been the case, of course, in 1619 when the first enslaved people came in, and really it wasn't until about 1700 that the enslaved people became the economic engine for Virginia's incredible prosperity. But, of course, this was a challenge because you have 4 out of 10 of your citizens you've got to kind of keep them under control. And so the big fear for the the big fear for the gentry was that the British would in some way try and either free the slaves or grant them rights or do something that would upset Virginia's very, very kind of precarious social system, right? And the reason they were fearful was that in 1773, a guy named James Somerset, who was he was an enslaved person brought from Africa. He was bought in the port of Norfolk, and then eventually his owner took him to London, whereupon he escaped. The owner sent out slave catchers. He was caught, and the British judge who oversaw what became a trial of what do we do with this slave determined that since England had no laws against slavery, they could not hold this man in bondage. So he was freed. And this was big news in the colonies, throughout the colonies. So by 1774, already you have the white people, white owners of enslaved people who are really nervous that the British Empire is going to try and subvert the economic system on which so many whites, and particularly the white gentry, depended.
The timing of things is really interesting, too. I mean, we, in New England anyway, we have grown up with the revolution beginning with events in Boston and in New England, the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, and that is the traditional history in the beginning of the revolution that we've all heard so many times. What was going on in Virginia at exactly that moment? Because what went on in Virginia actually proved to be more instrumental to the outcome of the building of the revolution to begin with, and then its outcome, than either Lexington and Concord or Bunker Hill.
Well, isn't it interesting that we, I am assuming maybe you as well, know so little about what was going on in the rest of the colonies? I mean, Lexington and Concord, tea in the harbor. I mean, these are our familiar myths, right? But what was going on in Virginia was every bit as important as George mentions, because without Virginia, then the rest of the southern colonies would not have followed. And Maryland, and probably Pennsylvania, and New York, and Delaware. So what was happening was really critical. And the reason why it has been not talked about is because it's a little complicated and uncomfortable. So what happened in April of 1775? You know what was happening in New England? The New England farmers were battling the redcoats. Well, in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, who had tried to keep a neutral policy toward this growing movement of patriots, he decides that he's got to do something. So he has several Marines seize gunpowder out of the arsenal in the middle of Williamsburg, which is the colonial capital.
This was 2 days after Lexington and Concord,
Yep.
So literally at the same time as what was happening in the north.
Because, of course, they didn't know what was happening. It took a good 10 days for the news to get from Boston to Williamsburg. So this all happened at the same moment. And the gunpowder was taken aboard a ship in the James River. And, of course, the Williamsburg inhabitants, at least the white inhabitants, they made up half the population, turned out en masse, really angry that Dunmore had taken their gunpowder. Well, that's the story I learned as a child. But the real story is a little more interesting, and that is that at that point there was talk of a slave insurrection. And so the white colonists actually were outraged that the governor had taken away the gunpowder that they would use not against British soldiers, because there were virtually none in Virginia, but it would prevent them from putting down a slave insurrection, which was, of course, the great fear that whites always lived with in this slave society. So at that point, a delegation of high-ranking people, including Peyton Randolph, who was the president of the Continental Congress, was a neighbor of Lord Dunmore. They knocked on his door and said, excuse us, you took our powder. Could we have it back? And he said, well, no, I took it because of the insurrection. I didn't want the enslaved people to get the powder. This is all for your benefit. And amazingly, the Patriots said, oh, okay. And they didn't pursue the matter. But a few days later, there was a talk of an attempt to attack the palace where the governor and his family lived. And remember, he has no troops to protect him in the middle of Williamsburg. And he decided to try and find a way to prevent the Patriots from storming his palace. And so he chose a very simple way. He simply told a local that he met that he would free the slaves and give them weapons. And let me tell you, the Patriots backed off really quickly because they were terrified that a slave insurrection, would not only destroy their economy, but destroy their entire social system. So this was a very smart move on the part of Dunmore because he was able to make this threat, which he didn't follow through on, and he was able to protect himself and his family and gain a lot of time. And actually, the House of Burgesses, which had not been meeting, eventually met a few months later, and they actually were negotiating with the governor. I mean, they were really terrified that he would do this, so they were willing to come to the negotiating table and talk about a way to resolve this conflict between Britain and the colonists.
And at this time, where the northern states were in open rebellion, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, there was no question that Massachusetts and the northern states were in a rebellion against Britain. Virginia was not. And the Virginia aristocracy, even though George Washington had by this time, or at least in June of 75 was when he took over the Continental Army, but the Virginia aristocracy still wanted peace with Britain at that point. Fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, remember, and we forget this because we look back through the lens of history, we know what happened. But in the 1760s, the colonists, when they raised a stink about the Stamp Act, for example, eventually Parliament repealed it. So the view in Virginia was, if we really put pressure on those guys in London, they will repeal this tax as well. And we also will get access to that land out west, which is what they really wanted in Virginia. So it was a very different dynamic than New England. So at the point where you have people fighting in New England against the Redcoats, in Virginia you still have the governor throwing balls where George Washington, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson are all dancing with the governor and his wife. So it's a really, really different dynamic because nobody in Virginia really expected things to go as far as independence. And it wasn't until early 1776 that even became a conversation. It really was about pressuring Parliament to back off, provide the land, deal with the taxes, the tea tax, so the New Englanders would be happy, and then they could go back, not to creating a new nation, but go back to this golden age of the 1750s, before Parliament was kind of meddling in the colonists' life. So this was not about creating a new nation based on new principles. Rather, it was going back to a time where the colonists felt they had a little more control over their destiny.
I mean, you can see how this was really a hinge moment, because if, in fact, the revolution had only been in the North, the British might well have been able to contain it. So Virginia joining in was ultimately the key to the revolution, expanding beyond the original 4 or 5 colonies, or even 2 or 3 in the beginning that were in rebellion. Talk a little bit about Dunmore as a provocateur, because he may have bought time by saying he might emancipate or threatening to emancipate the enslaved people in Virginia, but it was only a matter of time. Because and the gunpowder thing was also provocative, but ultimately that provocation came back to bite him.
Yeah. Well, Lord Dunmore, I think, is one of the most unknown characters in the American Revolution, but one of the most interesting because I think it's a Scottish Highlander whose father had been convicted of treason and was under house arrest for the rest of his life. And Dunmore grew up kind of in the shame of having been, being the son of a traitor. Dunmore was very aware of the impact that a rebellion could have on your personal life. He had seen Highland culture decimated in the aftermath of the Jacobite Rebellion, And so he was very savvy in the ways not just of rebellion, but also in how to fight the British. He had actually witnessed several times when the Jacobite army had defeated the British army. So he's an interesting character because he's the only governor who really had a sense of what was at stake. When the Virginia gentry weren't really thinking about outright armed rebellion, Dunmore already, I think, was seeing that this was going to turn into a very nasty situation. He needed troops. He needed ships. They were all in Boston, and the British commanders would not release them. They did not want to let any of their troops or ships go down to Virginia. He managed to get 100 or 200 troops, a couple of small ships, but that was it. So he really was on his own, and Dunmore was the only royal governor who really put up a fight, who decided against all odds that he was going to take on the Virginia gentry and then the white farmers eventually who joined that coalition.
So talk a little bit. First of all, bring the Native Americans into this story because they're kind of a fascinating subplot within this, and Dunmore's efforts to enlist them on his side.
Oh, this is one of the greatest, craziest plots in the American Revolution. So Dunmore, of course, is faced, as I said, with this problem of how do I create allies? I can't get British troops. So, okay, the enslaved people, they're obvious people I could draw on in order to create a fighting force against the Patriots. Who else? Oh, the indigenous people. Well, Dunmore himself had led a war against the Shawnee in 1774, in which he had, as I mentioned, he managed to basically annex all of Kentucky from the Shawnee people and insert it into Virginia's territory. So he knew these indigenous people very well. And actually, he had signed a treaty that the Shawnee considered relatively fair, given the situation. He actually had good relations, ironically, with these indigenous leaders. So his idea was this: all right, I got the enslaved people throughout Virginia who could fight for me. The indigenous people to the west, if I can rouse them, and I can actually send somebody to Detroit to kind of energize the British troops in Detroit, march them through the Midwest, march them into what is now West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and convince them to join with the British and attack Virginia from the west, then the Patriots would be trapped between this indigenous and British army on the one hand from the west and enslaved people on the east. So it was this crazy idea. When you look back, it's like, how could that have worked, marching from Detroit to Virginia? But it was actually a very, very smart way for him to make use of these people as allies, because he was very smart in saying, if the Americans win, if the Patriots win, you're out of luck. These people are going to flood into your land. They're going to take your land. Your only chance is to stop the Patriots because, we British, the king has made it clear he wants to protect your lands. The Patriots have no such idea. They are rapacious people who will come and take your land. So the indigenous people had a lot of reason to support Dunmore. But in the end, for reasons that I talk about in the book, the plot kind of unraveled in a very dramatic way.
Talk about and describe what happened then between June 1775 and the end of the year. And just set that stage. And I mean, there's a lot that went on then. But talk, sort of set that stage and describe what happened over those 6 months.
So remember, Bunker Hill happens in June of 1775. So in the north, what you have happening is the American troops, now led by George Washington, Lord Dunmore's former friend at that point, they're based in Cambridge, and they're facing this vast British army that's based in Boston with the British fleet. So that's really the war is happening in Boston, but it's a stalemate. After Bunker Hill, there really is not much of anything that happens. Virginia is very different because in June of 1775, Dunmore is finally forced to flee Williamsburg. He does this because there's an assassination or kidnapping plot by the Patriots. And so he gets wind of this, he leaves, but even then he's negotiating on a ship in the York River with the House of Burgesses, with the Virginia gentry. they're still trying to work out an arrangement because they don't really want to offend the king's representative. I mean, this is what's really interesting, is that even at this late date, the Virginia gentry are trying to make nice. But the negotiations break down, and Dunmore eventually decides that he has to leave. Yorktown is not a safe place. He has a couple British ships, but a couple of cannon could easily take out those ships from the bluffs above. So he moves his base of operations to Norfolk, Virginia, which is a port city in the east. And it's a very smart idea because, number one, lots of enslaved people in that city. And number two, there are these Scottish merchants who are good friends of Dunmore. These are Glasgow capitalists who have basically taken control of the tobacco trade and really are running a lot of Virginia's economy. So at that point, Dunmore sees that he can create allies with these Scottish merchants who can fund his attempt to oppose the Patriots, and the enslaved people are kind of there, although he doesn't make any move overtly at that point to try and actually put them under arms.
But then by October, November, as the Patriot Army in Virginia had built up and was proven to be much more formidable than he might have thought earlier, Dunmore was forced into effectively offering the first Emancipation Proclamation in this country. I mean, it's amazing how much his proclamation to free the enslaved people mirrored that of Abraham Lincoln. How many years later? 80-some-odd years later.
But let's back up, because the first battle south of New England took place in a town you probably never heard of called Hampton, Virginia, a little port not far from Norfolk, about 30 miles away. And the reason for this battle was not that the Patriots were angry that the British were taxing the colonists or weren't representing them in Parliament. The reason that this battle took place is because the British refused to turn over enslaved people that they had granted sanctuary to back to their Patriot owners. This is what really sparked the war in the South. What sparked the war was simply the fact that the British were accepting these refugees. They were giving them sanctuary on their ships. So enslaved people were slipping away at night. They were finding their way to these British ships. The British were allowing them to come on board. And the Patriots were outraged because this, obviously, as I mentioned yesterday, was proof of tyranny. Right? Because the British were stealing private property. And only tyrants steal private property. So this is what really angered the Patriots, because most of whom, of course, are slave owners. So they're constantly telling Dunmore, you've got to give these people back to us. And Dunmore's saying, no, we're not. They were serving as pilots. They were serving, in all kinds of important positions at that point. And then at that point, Dunmore begins to quietly, secretly train them, drill and provide weapons to these enslaved people who, by the hundreds, are beginning to show up in the around the shipyard in Gosport near Norfolk, where he has established his base. And that is where the snowball begins to roll. He begins to arm these people. They actually fight in the Battle of Hampton. And then later, the Battle of Kemp's Landing. And at the Battle of Kemp's Landing is a very small skirmish, actually, which is kind of obscure, but it's incredibly important because during that battle, 2 enslaved men managed to wound, and then capture their owner, who happens to be the militia commander, the Patriot militia commander. He's a very senior person in that part of Virginia. And they bring him to Dunmore, and Dunmore clearly is really impressed. I mean, I think he understands in a way that certainly the Patriots didn't, and then many British generals did later. He really understands that these black men are highly motivated to fight, and that they're pretty fearless. Because remember, just to leave your plantation, your forced labor camp, if you're captured, you could be subjected to torture. You could be imprisoned. Bad things would happen to you and your family. So simply the act of leaving their forced labor camps and going to the British was taking an enormous risk. So by that point, of course, they were very motivated because there was no turning back. Once they had left, they were all in to fight the Patriots and support the British. And the British, in turn, through Dunmore, saw an opportunity to use these people to fight the Patriots, and because there were no redcoats, right? So this was a really important tactic that Dunmore employed, and I think he did it because as a Highlander, a Scottish Highlander, he had witnessed the way the English treated the Highlanders, which was often not very good. I mean, they were often treated as barbarians, as drunks. And so I think he had a way of seeing African Americans that was quite different from your typical British governor, that he actually could see their value and see their capacity to fight. Just as the Highlanders were known for being tough fighters, he recognized in them something that other British leaders did not.
So we've got another 10 minutes, and I want to allow some time for any questions you might have. But let me ask you one other, to bring this full circle, if you will. And I'll just use the phrase Norfolk delenda est and take off from there.
Anybody a Latin scholar here? So at the end of 1775, Dunmore is basically entrenched around Norfolk, and he's fought a couple of battles with the Patriots. He's created the Ethiopian Regiment. He's created a whole regiment of black men who are wearing red coats and carrying muskets and are fighting their owners alongside British redcoats. So this is a very unusual situation, and the trouble is that the Patriots are just overwhelming in their numbers. And so by December of 1775, Dunmore is basically trapped on his ships with his troops, and the Patriots come into the port of Norfolk. They occupy it, and he's faced with this impossible situation. He's on his ships. He doesn't want to leave. He's got 3,000 people in the harbor on various ships. The Patriots are just 100 yards away on the shore. It's this terrible standoff. And then on January 1st, 1776, Dunmore sends troops ashore to take out snipers' nests in warehouses that are right there along the harbor. And then mysteriously, the entire city of Norfolk, the largest city in the colony, the eighth largest port in the country, goes up in flames. And it's the only city in American history that is entirely destroyed. Every single building is destroyed. And when I was raised, Lord Dunmore was the culprit. I was told he was the bad guy who burned down my hometown. But, of course, when I looked into it, it was clear that actually it's not true. It's Patriot propaganda. The Patriots used Dunmore's attack as an excuse to burn down this city. Why? Because people like Thomas Jefferson opposed even the concept of urban areas. They really didn't like the idea of merchants, a merchant system, a merchant class that was basically in competition with the plantation owners. So they had reason to destroy Norfolk that had nothing to do with relations with Britain. And that was, we want to get rid of the center of finance, which is basically the middlemen that are preventing us from getting the kind of wealth we think we deserve. And also, it was a haven for enslaved people. It was a great place. If you're an enslaved person, slip away, go to this city, and you could make a new life. So by destroying Norfolk, they were destroying basically an escape valve for enslaved people.
But talk about the lie, because that is so central to this story.
And this is a little shocking because I was raised to not say Thomas Jefferson or Jefferson, but Mr. Jefferson, right? And then I discovered that in October of 1775, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter, and the bottom of which, to a senior Virginia patriot, the bottom of which said, Delenda est Norfolk. This was a reference to a Roman senator who would end every speech with, Carthage must be destroyed. And Carthage eventually was destroyed, famously, according to 19th century sources, sowed with salt. So the city was decimated. So 2 months before Norfolk is destroyed, Jefferson already is suggesting that the Patriots should destroy their own city, even though it was not even occupied at that point by the British who were in the harbor. It's a very extraordinary fact that the Patriots were so angry at a city that really was still run by the Patriots. The Patriots were, there was a Patriot mayor. The city council was largely made up of Patriots. But this decision by Thomas Jefferson and other Patriot leaders, had a profound effect on the country, because when word got out that the British had burned Norfolk, then many Patriots decided, or many people who were on the fence decided it was time to join the opposition. It was time to become a patriot, because if the British are burning our cities, what's next? They're going to burn New York, Newport, Boston. So it was clear that the Patriots used this propaganda. They used the claim that the British had burned Norfolk in order to energize the flagging movement to declare independence. So it had a huge effect on the push by states like in New England as well as in Virginia to demand independence from Britain rather than trying to negotiate.
And it led to Virginia joining with the states in the North to signing on to the Declaration of Independence, in effect.
Well, remember, it was the Virginia resolution that was introduced in Congress to actually declare separation from Britain. And this took place at a time when Lord Dunmore still had his Ethiopian troops that were threatening Williamsburg. So at that point, the gentry in Williamsburg, who had been so conservative and had not wanted to go to war with Britain, realized that they had no choice. Here's a guy that's within a 30-mile march of the capital of Virginia, with enslaved troops as well as white troops, Scottish, and all kinds of people. This multiracial army that is threatening the Patriot center of Williamsburg, and they realize that the only choice they have is to declare independence. And so then they suggested that Congress should also do the same, and that resolution is what then set in motion what became the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, written, of course, by Thomas Jefferson.
So we've got a couple of minutes. Does anybody have a question? Yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, there's a microphone right over here.
Sorry.
Hi. Hello, is that on? So I'm just curious, when you're looking into all of this history, what is the fantasy if it had gone another way? What is the Dunmore winning look like? What is the alt history that you imagine when you're thinking about this stuff?
Well, there certainly is an alt history, and the one that I imagine is that this multiracial army, which basically was there are 3,000 people, black, white, people of all kinds of ethnicities that were together for about 6 months. And in that time, they created their own courts. They had ministers that were ministering to different faiths. Blacks and whites were mixing in a really radical way that had never been the case, even in the North. And you were essentially creating this kind of experimental society in which many people of all colors and shapes and sizes had to get along. And so my fantasy is that that experiment would have survived and then grown and provided the South with an alternative to the slave system, which then, of course, only metastasized over the next 4 or 5 decades.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this story. I'm curious about how you sourced it. I know all of your first-person sources were on deep background. But I'm just curious, in particular, how did you attribute the burning of Norfolk?
So there's a box in the Library of Virginia, and what's in it has never been transcribed. It's amazing. It's a stack of depositions made in 1777 by a Patriot committee that was tasked with understanding and determining what happened in Norfolk, who burned what dwelling. It's a highly detailed spreadsheet combined with depositions of people who were deemed good patriots who talked about what happened. They were eyewitnesses to the destruction of the city. And it's harrowing reading. There's a woman who's in labor And the Patriots burst into her room and they say, okay, you got to get out. We're burning your house. She says, I'm in labor. And she has to find a letter proving she's a good patriot. But nevertheless, her house later was burned. The incredible cruelty that was involved with the destruction of the city is really, really shocking. And it's something that has never been talked about among historians. These depositions really hadn't been looked at for decades. And now there's a move, I think, to both conserve them and provide transcriptions of them so they could be more widely available. Some of the best first-person accounts you'll ever find of the American Revolution. And they've been ignored, I think, because it's an uncomfortable fact. It's one of these inconvenient truths that in this instance, the Patriots were committing what is clearly a war crime. They were destroying a city that was not trying to oppose the Patriots.
I think we have to. One more question. Okay, great.
So, what happened to the Ethiopian regiment after the war?
Great question. So, what happened to the Ethiopian regiment? Well, at the end of 1770, in August of 1776, so a month after the Declaration has been signed, Dunmore's troops finally are overcome by two things. The Patriots finally get their act together and attack, and smallpox, typhus, and other diseases decimate all the soldiers, black and white. And so at that point, Dunmore has to weigh anchor, and his flotilla, containing hundreds and hundreds of people at that point, sails up to New York. The Ethiopian regiment then becomes part of the British Army. They actually take part in the Battle of Long Island when the British attack New York and George Washington is driven out of the city. And so they become part of what became known as the Black Pioneers. Although later British leaders did not give them guns, they were essential to the British war effort. And then at the end of that war, just to wrap it up, 10,000 black Americans were forced to leave this country because otherwise they would have been re-enslaved by the Patriots. And that's a whole other story of that diaspora, but it says a lot about our country that we have forgotten these people who were forced to leave the land of liberty.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think you can see why within 2 pages I was taken by this story and why Andrew has become one of my favorite
I
authors
want
of all
to see
time.
that proposal so I can learn how to write the proposal that captures an editor in 2 pages. So I need to see that. Because, someday I want to write a book. I have no idea what it's going to be about, but someday I'm going to write a book. Yeah, okay. Thank you, everybody. Just a reminder that you can buy Andrew's book at the book tent, the book sales tent, and he will be going right now over to the book signing